Do you remember when AAA games used to be a guaranteed good time? You knew you were in for an amazing game that had awesome visuals, a storyline that made you cry, and characters you couldn't get out of your head, even long after the game ended. Fast forward to 2024 and man, it really feels like we're paying $70 for bugs, endless updates, and let's not forget endless microtransactions. Today we'll be looking at why AAA games from the biggest studios are not as impressive as they used to be in the early 2000s. And no, that's not just rose-colored goggles of nostalgia clouding our judgment. We've got examples like No Man's Sky and Fallout 76 proving that even the biggest franchises struggle to keep their heads above water. But what went wrong? Are we asking a bit too much from these multi-million-dollar titles? Let's start with, what even is a AAA game? In short, it's a game produced by a big studio with a huge budget and even bigger expectations that back it up. Think about it much like Hollywood blockbusters, the biggest names, the greatest hype, and often the biggest letdowns. Now in earlier times, the AAA titles were considered an impressive achievement and guaranteed beautiful visuals, large worlds, and many hours of nail-biting gameplay. But as the budget grew, and the developers primarily took several years to create a game, something began to shift. Studios began to care more about profits and pleasing investors. And what do we get today? A sea of sequels, remakes, and games that sometimes feel way too safe. You see, big budgets don't always equate to big fun. In simpler terms, AAA games are giant money-making machines, often more focused on flashy marketing than thoughtful gameplay. While that's nothing new, it's gotten progressively worse in recent years, begging the question of more and more gamers as to whether these titles still deserve their elite status. On the other hand, there we were, amidst indie games that gain recognition little by little with their innovation and creativity. But that's for later in this video. Let's take a moment to address one of the most irritating trends that have evolved from the modern AAA game development period: the overemphasis on graphics and realism. I mean, sure, sometimes high-class visual images can be attractive. But what if this comes at the cost of well-crafted gameplay? Take Cyberpunk 2077 for example. Countless teasers running up to its release literally set standards too high for an exceptionally detailed world. On the day of release, I mean, sure, the visuals were great, but the overall experience was just disappointing. The focus on photorealistic environments and character models was so strong, yet these very same visuals were ruined by endless bugs and glitches that made the game unplayable. This is precisely how some developers overemphasize internals and dramatics over other details, which honestly just messes up all the remaining aspects of the game. The portrayal of reality in video games has been widely accepted as the first and foremost goal of any game development. But the amount of fun you'll have while playing is not really guaranteed. At some point, developers seem to have forgotten that games are supposed to be fun, not just visually stunning. Sure, we appreciate when trees in the background look lifelike, but if the gameplay feels stiff or repetitive, does it even matter? Now let's face it, when it comes to AAA games, the gameplay can often feel like the same old soup, reheated and served with a new garnish. Whether it's the millionth open-world game with towers to climb or another cover-based shooter with predictable set pieces, AAA games have fallen into a comfort zone. They're playing it safe by sticking to what works. But it's precisely this lack of risk-taking that turns players off. One big culprit here is the Far Cry series. While the earlier titles were praised for their open-world innovation, by the time Far Cry 6 was released, the formula had become painfully repetitive. You liberate outposts, climb towers, rinse, repeat. The world looks incredible, but the gameplay feels stale. Another good example would be the Assassin's Creed series. Ubisoft seems to be recycling the same gameplay loop into different titles: stealth, parkour, combat, repeat. Sure, they'll throw in a new setting or a time period, but really, core gameplay hasn't evolved much since old Ezio days. That formula might bring in new players, but for seasoned fans, it starts to feel like the developers don't really care about them. Studios know a formula sells, so they stick with it, even when it's not particularly fun. It's as if they're too afraid to step out of the box and try something new, for fear that it will fail or, far worse, cost investors dollars. But if there's one thing that really drives players up the wall, it's the microtransactions and DLCs. There was a time when you bought a game, and that was it. You owned the whole package. But in today's AAA landscape, getting the full experience often feels like a luxury you have to keep paying for, bit by bit. The problem with microtransactions is that they moved beyond just cosmetic items. Sure, buying a cool skin for your character isn't the end of the world, but when microtransactions start affecting gameplay, that's when the line gets crossed. Look at FIFA's Ultimate Team mode, where players spend real money on card packs to improve their squad. It's not just about skill anymore, it's about how much money you're willing to spend. This creates an uneven playing field, where players who can spend more have a clear advantage, turning what should be a fun competitive experience into a pay-to-win system. Then there's the issue with DLCs. Remember when Destiny 2 launched and then immediately offered expansions for content that felt like it should have been part of the base game? Players weren't just upset, they felt like they were being deceived. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, this game had multiple DLCs, but many fans argued that key parts of the story were locked behind paywalls. Instead of enhancing the experience, these expansions started to feel like developers had intentionally stripped content to sell later. The growing dependency on microtransactions and DLCs isn't just a business strategy. It's damaging the trust between developers and players. The idea of dropping $70 on a game only to be told, hey, here's an expansion for $30 more, feels unfair. What happened to delivering a complete, polished product on day one? Microtransactions and DLCs are now a core part of AAA game development, and they're being forced onto players in a way that's ruining the fun. Instead of playing for the experience, you're constantly reminded of the price tag hanging over every in-game decision. And the sad truth is, for many AAA games today, you're not just paying once, you're paying to keep the fun going if it ever arrives at all. One of the biggest reasons AAA games have become so bland is the complete avoidance of risk in proven money-making formulas. This fear of taking risks is largely driven by investors who want guaranteed returns, pushing developers into a corner where creativity takes a backseat. Instead of experimenting with new mechanics, stories, or genres, AAA publishers play it safe, leaning heavily on sequels, remakes, and franchises that have been successful in the past. Let's be honest, how many more Call of Duty or FIFA releases do we really need? These yearly franchised games are examples of how titles have not changed over the years in any significant manner, and players already know what to expect since there's barely any room for surprise or innovation. It's a bottom-line strategy. Huge publishers like EA, Ubisoft, and Activision are fully aware that the familiar formulas sell, and changing things may reduce sales or alienate their audience. This reluctance to innovate doesn't just end with the gameplay. Look at the storytelling in recent AAA games, where many major releases rely on the same old, overused ideas and narratives. Instead, publishers force the creation of games that are cinematic experiences, hyper-focused on realism, forgetting that players come for fun and engaging gameplay. This fear of failure creates these bland and repetitive video games that feel more like products checking corporate boxes, rather than works of art intended to entertain. Creativity keeps the gaming world fresh, and without risking or trying something new, AAA titles will continue to feel shallow. But the major issue with all these big budget games today is that the people who make them don't seem to care much about what players want. They seem more interested in making money and keeping investors happy. This resulted in a strained relationship where developers have been pushing out content more investor-driven and crafted for players that actually engage in these games. Let's take Cyberpunk 2077, which launched after years and years of hype and came out full of bugs and technical problems. Predictably, this left everyone feeling betrayed because of its state at launch. It turns out that decisions were made on deadlines and profits, but not on how to make a polished and enjoyable game. Developers like Ubisoft used to listen to what fans said, but now they seem to have forgotten what made those games so popular in the first place. They're not paying attention to what players really want. This disconnect between gamers and developers is felt everywhere, as their complaints are only met with vague promises or fixes in the form of costly DLCs or patches many months after the titles hit the shelves. The farther the developers are from the needs and desires of their audience, the more the gaming experience suffers. Players aren't just consumers, they're communities, And when a developer stops listening to those communities, the end result is a lifeless, disconnected, and uninspired game. This growing distance between the creator and gamers is one of the main reasons AAA titles can't make fun and engaging experiences like they once could. Now, while AAA titles rely on old formulas, indie games burst into the scene to quickly become the breath of fresh air needed in the gaming world. Unlike the constraint placed on large AAA publishers who have to produce a profit and keep investors happy, indie developers can innovate, take risks, and create concepts that are just too big for bigger studios to handle. This creative freedom caused a wave of indie games that focus more on unique mechanics, storytelling, and player engagement than just graphics or generating revenue. Take Hades, for instance. It combined tight combat mechanics with well-developed characters which carved its niche in an ocean of play-it-safe and utterly predictable AAA titles. Similarly, Celeste was deeply personal and emotional in its journey, while keeping the challenging yet rewarding gameplay intact, something that seemed missing in larger releases. It's not an accident or a fluke that these indie titles have been doing so well. Rather, it shows that players are looking for innovation and creativity over flashy graphics and a big-budget marketing campaign. Indie games remind us that it's not the size of the studio or the budget, but passion, originality, and attention to detail that goes into creating something truly engaging. Indie titles have given gamers a chance to experience games that value fun and creativity a lot more than modern AAA titles of money-making. AAA gaming has become notorious for the fact that it relies so much on marketing to build hype, but it comes at the cost of substance and quality. Big-budget games often spend a lot of money on marketing. They use strats like cinematic trailers, famous people, and special offers to spread excitement amongst players. Yet over and over, these games fail to deliver on those promises after the hype in their marketing blitz. One of the most notorious examples of this was the AAA hype machine gone wrong, Cyberpunk 2077. For years, this game was promised as a revolutionary, immersive world that would set a new bar for RPGs. Millions of gamers pre-ordered the game based on sleek trailers and big-name promotions. But when it finally came out, it became clear that the marketing oversold what was possible within the game. The game had a lot of bugs, broken mechanics, and missing features that made players feel like they were robbed. And no, this isn't an isolated incident. No Man's Sky similarly fell victim to unrealistic expectations due to marketing. The developers are too often stuck in a repeating cycle. Keep investors happy by pushing unfinished games out the door to make a deadline and then rely on post-launch patches to fix what should have been fixed well before shipping. The industry also heavily relies on nostalgia and brand recognition in the sale of games. Just think about any Call of Duty game, which survives way more on brand recognition than on innovative gameplay. In reality, those titles sell every year, as if they're new experiences, while the new things they offer are often a little more than a fresh coat of paint. Games are often advertised with big promises that don't come true, making players frustrated and question if big-budget games are even worth it. As a result, many players are looking for games with actual engagement while staying true to what they advertise. Well, we've talked about how AAA games have become horrible. But is there any way these games can regain some of that lost sense of fun and innovation? Gamers often complain about things like microtransactions, boring gameplay, and bugs. But maybe it's time for the developers to listen to the player base. I mean, it could win trust back, and most importantly, create games that respond to the players. Developers also need to be more willing to try new things, while being honest with players about what the game will be like. Amazing games like The Witcher 3 and Red Dead Redemption 2 were successful because they did things differently. They had new stories, new ways to play, and new worlds. And now that players are getting smarter, they can tell if a game is being advertised unfairly. If developers are honest about the game's gameplay, features, and how well it works, players will have realistic expectations and won't feel disappointed. This could spark passion again in the AAA game space if players are given priority, rather than fulfilling investor demands. There should be enjoyment, immersion, and creativity in games instead of just profit. Now, it does seem like AAA games have lost some of their magic, from overemphasized graphical focus and realism to mind-numbingly repetitive gameplay and microtransaction nightmares. It's no surprise that many are abandoning big-budget titles. An industry that once was driven by innovation is now increasingly formulaic, and centered on profits. But there's still hope. If the developers could listen to their communities for once and put fun over financial incentives, maybe AAA games could be great again. At the end of it all, gaming is supposed to be about fun, be it exploring huge open worlds, fighting battles, or taking in a deep story. At the end of it all, it should be an experience that has us all hyped for what's to come, instead of ticking off hours until it's uninstalled. So here's to hoping that the future of AAA games will learn from its mistakes by embracing creativity and passion once again. The story doesn't have to end here. The gaming industry is constantly evolving, and who knows, the next big revolution could be right around the corner. Was I being too harsh on AAA titles, or are the criticisms justified? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe for more gaming content where we break down the issues that matter most to gamers. So until next time, we'll see you in the next video.